Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to the webinar. I wanted to get started right on time. We will go no later than 11 o'clock, but I just wanted to make sure that we have everything set to go. Looks like you can see my screen okay. And I will go over some quick housekeeping things before we get into the content of today's training, of course, which is talking about maintaining a professional workplace during uncertain times. That's a conversation I think many of us have been having in our organizations, and I think it's always just helpful to kind of check in with how we're feeling and get some strategies. And so I wanted to quickly go over here before we get into everything, like I had said earlier here, some housekeeping pieces on your end. The first thing I will say is under the handouts tabs, that little white arrow next to handouts, if you click on that, you'll see two separate PDF files. And for you, it'll be the slide deck that you'll see. So just the title of today's slides. And then also that second handout, which is webinar tech support. If anyone is having any technical issues of any kind, please start there. So you can download that PDF. It gives you all sorts of options in terms of how to troubleshoot any technical issues. And I've had almost everyone who had technical issues, if they looked at that, they've been able to resolve the issue with that information. So I wanted to, right off the bat, make sure everyone knew where to access that if you were having any technical problems. Hopefully no one is, but that's where to go if you need anything. And then also, if you need to communicate with me, the best way to do that is you'll see here, and this is where this screenshot on the slide here, you can see under questions. So make sure to type it in under that questions section. So if you click that white arrow, you'll see a section here under questions. You can just type that in. As it mentions up on the top of the slide here as well, we have a lot of attendees today. And so I know that sometimes people may not feel comfortable typing in a question if they think people will see who asked it. We default to anonymity just for everyone's comfort level. So when you do type in a question, I'm the only one who sees that. So I will keep an eye on the questions box and then see what, if there's anything coming in. I'll answer as many as I can, but when I do have a question come in, I will just say, I'll summarize the question itself, but I'm not going to say who asked it. And I know that someone chatted in asking if other people could hear me. Hopefully other people can, because I know my microphone seems to be working if my subtitles are working. But if you can't hear me, again, go to that handout section, download that webinar tech support, and you may have some options there as to how to resolve that audio issue, because there's options of calling in instead or troubleshooting speakers and things like that. So definitely we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, but if there is a question that you have about the content as I'm going through it, you can always just type that in during the presentation. I may be able to answer it right then as I'm on that slide, but I also may wait until the end. And I'll get to as many questions as I can. We do have a large group today, but I will hopefully try to answer as many questions as come up. And then the other thing too is that I will have a few live polls that we'll do. Of course, they're completely optional, but they are completely anonymous. And of course, the more people who do them, the more interesting the results. And so if you're willing to participate in any of the polls, that's wonderful. And again, they're totally anonymous, so no one will know if you participated or how you answered it. So that's always kind of a good way of engaging a little bit and kind of seeing where the group is at. And we're at almost 60 attendees right now. I know there's probably going to be a few folks joining a little bit late, totally understandable. We're all very busy. So I want to just jump right into the content and kind of talk about some of these overarching themes that all of us are experiencing, and then really how that impacts communication strategies, our ability to communicate effectively, and what that looks like in the workplace. So, as we get started here, this first slide, I think that most of us, are aware of this, and were aware of this prior to the pandemic, but certainly are now, that we are in a state of chronic anxiety. So generally our sort of brains and bodies are meant to have situational anxiety. So there may be a kind of short-term circumstances causing anxiety, that anxiety peaks and then it comes back down and we go about our day. But when it's chronic, such as a global pandemic and so many other things in the world going on, we're just at this constant state of anxiety. And I'll talk a little bit later how that shows up and how our brain functions. But it really does impact our health, our mental health, certainly, but also our physical health. It impacts our ability to sleep, which, as we all know, when we don't get great sleep, it certainly impacts our ability to communicate, feeling healthy, feeling balanced. And so I think, for a lot of people, we're feeling burnt out, we're feeling tired, and, it's really challenging. So if you're thinking to yourself, I'm doing the best I can here, but this has been a really, really tough, I think now almost 20 months, you're certainly not alone. And as I continue to provide some coping skills as we go through here and some strategies, one thing that I find really helpful in terms of self-care, or even starting with self-care, is figuring out, what do I need? Because we may say, I'm really burnt out right now, but you may need emotional support from that burnout. You may need logistical support, such as, talking to a supervisor about needing help on a project. Where is the burnout happening? Where is the anxiety happening? And then if we can figure out what our needs are, we can more directly approach the coping skills that can address those. And a lot of us probably have needs in all of those categories, and logistical, which isn't even on that. So 5 things. So it's not that we're always going to have one of the list, but if we can narrow down what we need and what it would look like if something had improved, that's going to help us a lot. So I think it's just kind of a starting point of, where am I at right now? What are some of my needs? How am I feeling about what my workplace looks like? And also, I recognize that everyone attending today is in a different circumstance in terms of their work situation. They may be working from home. They may be not working from home. It might be a hybrid model. That their organization might be moving back to reintegrating in office, or whatever the workplace looks like. So everyone's in a different circumstance. All of them can bring their own stress and anxiety. And so hopefully, as we go through here, a lot of these skills can be utilized regardless of your specific circumstance, because we do have this kind of overarching stress that I think, regardless of some of how our workplace is set up, of how we're communicating with people, how we are trying to get through all of this. But I just wanted to clarify that I totally recognize that everyone's in a different circumstance when it comes to their workplace setting. All right, so let's get into communication, since that is what we're talking about. And we could communicate about communication for a lot longer than 40 minutes or so, but we're going to do our best. A lot of this is to really think about, what are some takeaways that I can, leave this training just considering as I move forward. I also want to clarify, nobody's perfect at communication, and that's certainly not the goal. We're not ever striving for perfection. I think that sets us up for even more anxiety, and no one needs that right now. So we are, again, doing the best we can, but I like to really think about, how was I taught to communicate? Who taught me? Our brains and our bodies are really function off of habit. And so the way we were taught to communicate growing up, by caregivers, media, teachers, society, all of these things, peers, may or may not be super effective. But if it's what we've always been doing, we tend to just kind of lean into that habit and proceed on. And a lot of this is around self-awareness. What aspects of the way I communicate are working, what maybe need to be changed, or that I need to look at doing differently. And another key piece here is that there's this idea of a locus of control, what's in my control and what's not. One thing that is in your control is how you choose to communicate. So I would encourage everyone, just as a kind of larger psychological practice of, what are my default communication strategies? What are some of my strengths in that area? What might be some of my weaknesses? And all of us have both of those things. And the more we can learn what they are and be willing to acknowledge what they are, we can actually do something about it. So there's also the levels of interpersonal effectiveness. I'll use this term as we go through here. Interpersonal effectiveness is essentially just, a fancy term for communicating. So if we're thinking about how we communicate effectively, there's the first tier, which is objective effectiveness. What does that mean? It just means when I'm communicating information to someone else, is it clear? Do they understand what I'm saying? Maybe I'm giving them a training on at work on a new task that they have to do. Can they follow along objectively with the information, and does it make sense? So then we move into the kind of subjective piece. So the relationship effectiveness. Did this communication maintain a healthy relationship? You know, did both of us leave still in a good space afterwards? And that kind of leads into that third one, where sometimes, and I'll talk about some barriers to communication here in a moment, we may find that we tend to be fairly passive, or feel like we, you know, leave situations and didn't really express our needs, or we'll always default to what the other person needs. And this isn't about whether something's wrong or right. It's just determining, you know, did I leave feeling respecting myself and that other person, and really finding that balance. So this also, I think, what helps me when I break down communication skills in this way is, instead of just thinking, I want to communicate more effectively, number one, the question is why. I know that sounds strange, but it helps to know, why do I want to communicate effectively for me personally? How would that change my workplace? How would that change my well-being? What's the, you know, the goal here? And if you can have an intrinsic motivation, that's always going to help with setting those goals and reaching those goals. And then also thinking, if I was suddenly communicating more effectively tomorrow, how would things look different? And that's where we can really get into the measurables. So it's kind of the, why do I want to do this, and what would it look like if it was better? So if it's thinking, you know, I really notice that sometimes in meetings when if I'm training, you know, a new employee, they have a tough time understanding what I'm explaining. Maybe I need to really focus on objective effectiveness, and the way that I'm explaining something might be how I would understand it, but not someone else. So I can, you know, learn to explain things differently. Or I tend to talk over people when we're communicating, and that doesn't really respect me or them. So I need to work on not interrupting during conversation. So all these things, the more measurable we can get, the more we can work on them. But this is just kind of a way of demonstrating, kind of showing how these different levels of communication show up. All right, let's do a poll question, get everyone, you know, actively participating. We have almost 70 people right now. So I'm going to launch this first poll. You should see that on there. So it's just asking you to rate yourself. I'm confident in my ability to communicate effectively. And the answers are also already coming in. Once we get a decent amount of you having voted, over almost all of you have already. This is great. We've got great participation. I'll give it about 10 more seconds, and then I'll show you the results. All right. So we had 85% of you voted. I'd say that's a pretty good amount. Let me see here. Okay, here we go. All right. So we've got a decent amount at the somewhat and strongly agree. That is wonderful. And so this is the other thing too, is it's very easy to answer this, and it's common if you were asked this question later today or tomorrow, you might answer it differently. You know, there's times where we feel more or less confident about something. And I think it's always good just to check in with that. And also, number one, if you're in the somewhat disagree, I promise you're not alone. You can see that in the stats. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think being honest with ourselves and where we're at, and then determining, you know, why did I answer it that way? How would moving from somewhat disagree to somewhat agree look for me? How would I know I was getting better at this? And also, the goal is never, I'm going to be perfect at communicating. It's just, I want to improve those skills. All right. So thank you for everyone who participated. So when we're thinking about holistic communication and dialectics, which means, as you can see here, two things can be true at the same time, I have found to be very helpful to remember when I'm talking to people about communicating, or I myself am communicating, because a lot of breakdown in interpersonal dynamics, whether it's one-on-one or multiple people, is people come in, whether they are aware of it or not, into a conversation with this underlying goal of, this conversation is going to be successful as long as the other person or other people end up agreeing that I'm right at the end. It's sort of this debate mentality. And when everyone's feeling that way, it just turns into, I just need them to agree with my side. And that's not always going to happen. And so practicing, you know, and dialectical behavior therapy also talks about what's called radical acceptance. Is like two things can be true at the same time. There can be multiple opinions about something, multiple perspectives, and it may not be what I wish was happening. Maybe it's like, I really wish they agreed with me on this, and a person may not. So how we sit with that. So sometimes I try to really go into it of, if I'm about to have a conversation with someone about anything, shifting away from, this conversation is going to go well as long as we end it with everyone being on the same page, and it would be, the one that is my perspective. So when we'll get more into kind of some strategies for that as we go through here. But dialectical behavior therapy, the reason I bring it up, it is an evidence-based therapeutic practice, but the reason I like it is that it really has these 4 key components. We already talked about interpersonal effectiveness. Again, that's essentially communication and effective communication with other people. Then there's our ability to regulate emotions. So any emotion we may be feeling, we can be aware of it. We can learn how to regulate it effectively. So if we're feeling sad, if we're feeling frustrated, if we're whatever we're feeling, we can identify what it is. We can learn to sit with it and not have it be all-consuming or cope with it in an unhealthy or ineffective way. And so it's really that ability to regulate those feelings, whatever those feelings are. Mindfulness, that's ability to be present, to be mindful of our surroundings, ourselves, other people. There's a level of empathy with that too. So we're mindful of our thoughts and our feelings and our environment, and can be present in that. So a lot of that is kind of shifting away from avoidance or denial and that ability to be present. And then distress tolerance, this is a big one. I don't know that we learn enough of this, and it's so much of what kind of shows up in breakdown in communication, is, as it says here, the ability to tolerate distress. And a lot of what I hear when I used to work with clients, or when I still do trainings now, is sometimes a sense of, how do I just figure out how to not have to have difficult conversations? Or how do I figure out how to just not feel anxious anymore? And that would be great, that would be wonderful if that could happen. The challenge is that in life, and I think all of us are well aware of this now, but probably have been for a long time, is that we can't set up an environment that we're never going to be faced with feeling distress about something, because there are a lot of things in life that are outside of our control. And that's where it's different than that emotion regulation. They're very similar. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. Is we can tolerate distress more effectively when we learn to regulate our emotions. And so that is where it's really learning, how do I change my relationship to my emotions, rather than deciding these are the emotions I'm willing to feel and these are the ones I'm not. And this really impacts communication, again, because we will start to say, I'm good at communicating as long as everyone's on the same page, or I'm good at communicating as long as everyone's feeling good, or, in a good emotional state. And that's just not always possibly the case. It's just not always going to be. So being able to tolerate distress instead of avoiding it, being able to trust that we can sit with that discomfort and still regulate those emotions. All right, so I have a couple, I'll do a poll at the end, but I have another one that I want to do, and then this will be the second of 3 polls, and the third one will be at the end of the training. Okay, so I wanted to kind of clarify what those 4 components are. Hopefully my objective effectiveness kicked in there. So I wanted to do this quick poll and see how people were feeling about this. So the question is, the DBT skill I need the most work in is. So think about which one you need to learn the most or improve the most on. All right, we've got about half of you have voted. Okay, we'll give it about 10 more seconds. All right, got 90% voted. Nice, awesome. That was 2% more than last time, so there you go. All right, so let me close out that poll and let me share the results, because I think this one's pretty interesting. All right, here's where we are. So there's someone in every category, but as we can, yes, I'm just looking at this in real time with the rest of you. I am not surprised. So So this is what's so interesting, is that and this is just a personal opinion, but I feel like this poll kind of speaks to this as well, of how significant our ability or our struggle with tolerating distress. And when we don't know how to tolerate distress very well, whatever level of distress that is, it just completely starts to impact every area of our life. And we get into denial, avoidance, unhealthy coping skills, whether that's communicating unhealthily or coping individually unhealthy, all these things. So I appreciate everyone's feedback. Also, you can see there's almost as much on the emotion regulation piece. And this is what's so interesting about these stats, and whether we're all realizing this at once or not. And this may not be the most exciting feedback you're going to get, but one of the biggest takeaways here, and this poll just underscores this, is that in the end, so much of making these improvements or creating a healthy workplace or a healthy environment starts with ourselves. It is our job to learn how to tolerate distress more effectively, not someone else's. It is our job to learn how to regulate our emotions effectively, not someone else's. And that requires work. And for most of us, that's where we start to feel like, I don't know if I want to do that. That feels like a lot of work, and it is. So that's where it's number one, nobody's perfect. It's not all of a sudden I have to be perfect at all of these starting tomorrow. What I would consider is whichever one you chose from that list, just start there and be like, all right, if I chose distress tolerance as the one I need the most work in, why did I choose that? If I was suddenly tolerating distress more effectively tomorrow, how would that look different for me? And I'm just going to get a few quick skills in place to put this into practice. And that's where it's putting it on a scale. Instead of I'm either good at this or I'm not, think, 10 being perfect, 1 being I don't have the skill at all. Where do you put yourself on that? And 10 is never the goal, as a reminder. So if you chose distress tolerance on that poll and you thought to yourself, oh, maybe I'm a 3 out of 10 in terms of this skill, the thought is, if I was a 4 tomorrow instead, what would I be doing differently? Just small steps make a huge difference. And also the other reason I like talking about DBT is if you Google dialectical behavior therapy skills or worksheets, there are tons of resources online. So if you like those kind of more concrete strategies, you can find those online. All right, let's move on. So more barriers to effective communication, and then we'll get into, so what do we do about it? I talked about some of this already, but a lot of times our ego can get in the way. That is part of being human. All of us, struggle with this. So this goes back to that dialectics piece. It's really hard to be communicating and then not end it with feeling like, I was right at the end. They saw my point of view and realized I was the right one, So two things be true at the same time. We also maybe kind of fall on the spectrum of, I've heard so many people say they're kind of people pleasing, and so they have a tough time being assertive or expressing their opinions or thoughts. We take things very personally. So when that shows up in the workplace right now, certainly when everyone's under extra stress, when people are under extra stress, they tend to be more irritable. They tend to, all of these things. And so maybe someone said something a certain way to you in a meeting, and it's hard not to take it personally. And sometimes it's just stepping back, and it doesn't mean that we don't, isn't something we may talk to them about later, or that it's still important that all of us are respecting each other. But sometimes we can get very caught up in taking everything personally, and a lot of times it's really not about us. And then there's that competitiveness or defensiveness. The tendency to blame, what I would say with that is that there is sometimes that sense of, I'm communicating perfectly, it's just that this other person isn't. It's always they're the ones that are breaking down the communication, and communication is always a two-way street. So really, instead of one person's to blame and one person isn't, how do we just try to communicate where we're all respecting each other? All right, so I'm gonna just quickly read this really quickly, and then we'll go into some skills. So I find it really helpful to just look at this quote. So what she's saying is, sometimes we can get very egocentric, like, if you don't respect me, I don't have to respect you. And that's kind of like two fools arguing. Nobody wins in that situation. There have been times when I've taken it personally and I needed to step back and take a breath. It's not about me, but it became about me when I let that power struggle happen. If I'm met with rudeness and disrespect, I'm going to still respect the other person as a human being. I know this is easier said than done, but again, when we realize how much of our ego can show up, and it's this sense of, you know, this back and forth that just ends up being this never-ending challenge of ever getting on the same page. And on the same page doesn't mean we agree necessarily, but at least on the same page of mutual respect. So if we're having difficult conversations or difficult interactions, one thing that helps me is separating it from difficult behavior versus difficult people. It's very easy for us to fall into that person is always that way, or everything they do is quote unquote difficult. But that really is reducing that person to, you know, only being a certain way. If we see someone through that lens, what ends up happening is that every time we go into a conversation with them, we're already set up to assume that they're going to be a certain way, and we actually treat them differently. It's that self-fulfilling prophecy. So I try to really step back and think about the behavior itself. You know, what about this is quote unquote difficult? Is it because they always interrupt me? Is it because they, you know, whatever the case may be, what's the actual measurable behavior? Because if you can focus on the behavior, then when we talk later about ways to communicate needs, such as I statements, you can talk about the behavior, not the person, which reduces defensiveness. It can just get to the core of the, you know, situation and then move on instead of labeling them a certain way. So really focusing on what's the behavior itself. Also, medium of communication, really thinking about, is this best via email, you know, or is it better to talk virtually, or if we're in person, whatever kind of the workspace looks like for you. So really consider, you know, I would always argue that emotionally charged emails are just never a good idea. And so really being mindful of how we communicate on all mediums. And then I share this last bullet point because of how many times I have worked with clients or done immediate telephone counseling or consultations with employees where, and I totally get this, where they're just thinking, I don't understand why this person is this way. Like, why could they be this way, you know? And you may never know. There could be so many reasons, and it may have oftentimes nothing to do with you. It doesn't mean it's not stressful, or it may not, or it may be something you still need to address, but it's doing that in a more, you know, a professional, effective way. But we can, all of us do this. And again, this affects sleep too. You know, a lot of people will say, I just lay in bed at night, just spinning about what someone said or what happened in a meeting, or it doesn't have to be work related, some type of interpersonal dynamic. And a lot of what I hear that spinning is just thinking over and over again, like, why are they that way? And it just is exhausting for our brain. So these are, you know, when we talk about some kind of coping skills of how do I regulate myself when my brain starts going into that spinning mode, you know, overthinking that isn't helping me at all. So that's one thing I try to just remind myself. So I talked a little bit earlier about the kind of brain chemistry. We are not going to go into a science talk, but I think what's helpful is that if we're thinking about maintaining a psychologically safe workplace for ourselves, for other people, you know, this is also goes with the poll questions around that distress tolerance piece. Because what happens is when we are under a lot of stress, if we're feeling emotionally triggered, this dark purple part of our brain goes offline, because it really goes into fight, flight, freeze mode. As you can see here, we're just in survival mode. There's something, the chemicals in our body are feeling triggered. We go into survival mode and we just need to survive at that point. So it shuts off what isn't absolutely critically necessary in that moment. The challenge with that is when you're feeling distress, emotional distress, and then also trying to have an effective conversation, that is really difficult when that neocortex isn't participating. So, because we aren't using our logic, we aren't really using our ability to see things from multiple perspectives. You know, here's 3 different ways I could respond. What is probably going to be the best one? It puts us into reactive mode. So if you've ever been in an emotionally charged situation, it's like, whoa, I just said that and shouldn't have said that. A lot of times it's because that dark purple part of our brain has gone offline. Later, once we get back online, that's when we start looking back and it's like, I can't believe I said it that way, or the way I tried to respond didn't make sense. You know, and that will come up too, is we'll be overthink or mad at ourselves that we responded the way we did because we weren't very clear. That's because we weren't thinking clearly. So I try to really think about, if I'm wanting to, for my own self-care and for my own ability to have people understand me, all of us be on the same page about what's going on, as much as possible, bring that whole brain online before communicating, especially obviously when it's something that is a charged topic or a conversation. And this takes a lot of practice. It's really difficult for us to not be reactive when we're feeling triggered by something. And that is the core of distress tolerance. And I think part of it is we can become more responsive when we can shift away from, but they just need to see that I'm right. And that sense can cause us anxiety or sort of this immediate need to jump in and say something, and this back and forth of, I'm going to practice dialectics, and both of us are going to maybe continue to have our own opinion on this. What I'm going to do is, and I'll provide some distress tolerance skills in a second here, try to bring my, cortex back online and then choose how I want to respond. And it's funny because in the moment we feel like what's going to make us feel the best is just react right away and say the right response. But actually what's really the most empowering is when we have that emotion regulation and distress tolerance working, because we've then allowed ourselves the moment to make a choice for what's best for us and the situation and still respects that other person. So slowing down is actually a choice of feeling more empowered in that we gave ourselves space to be able to make a choice. So some things to consider, and this is kind of the check-in with ourselves. So it's like, all right, I'm going to take a moment here before I react, because I don't want to react, I want to respond. And it also doesn't always, every single situation doesn't always require a response either. But if we are choosing to respond, or whatever the case may be, every circumstance is different. These are some things that I think can be helpful to ask myself. So first of all, if I'm feeling triggered or feeling distress, how do I even notice that? How is my body feeling? Is my heart racing? Do I feel like that those feelings of anxiety, but how do they even feel in my body? Start just naming those symptoms, because you can kind of depersonalize a little bit and get out of your head if you're naming some of those physiological symptoms. On a scale it, how anxious am I feeling? How frustrated am I feeling? How whatever am I feeling? And then, what would happen if I just didn't do anything for 5 minutes? And I realize every circumstance is different. You may have to respond to something right away, but these are just examples of things to check in with yourself about. And then, how can I look at the situation in a different perspective? Could I slow down enough to see this through a different lens that I'm looking at right now? Because when we get really triggered, we get in this kind of anxious defensive state. So trying to slow down and see different perspectives is really powerful. And then I think this number 7 can be helpful too. Like, if I am about what I want to say right now in my reactive brain, if I said that, is that in line with my values or not? And a lot of times I'll have people say, I regret what I said when I was triggered, and it didn't come out the way I meant, and I had to address that later on. So really just kind of being aware of, and this again goes into with this psychological safety, how am I communicating that's respecting me and that other person? Does this situation have to be resolved this second? When we are triggered and feeling in that fight, flight, freeze, our brain is telling us, yes, it does, it's an emergency. Maybe it's a circumstance that is. A lot of times it's not. It's just that our brain and body thinks that it is because it's triggered. So do I have to respond to this right now? A lot of these can be really helpful to ask ourselves if we're about to send an email, because I've had so many people, send a reactive, emotionally charged email and be like, I don't know that I needed to send that. So these can be ways that you can check in with yourself. So some other things to consider in terms of that self-regulation piece, and this really comes into play with emotion regulation, with distress tolerance. One thing, and I'm going to have everybody do this right now, well, if you want to, obviously, is this one right here. So if you're sitting, if you're standing, wherever you are, just drop your shoulder, like relax, drop your shoulders and relax your face and unclench your jaw. And I'd be fascinated, because we have 70 people here today, what you noticed when you did that. And I would argue most of us, when we went to do that, realized how much tension we were holding in our jaw, our face, our shoulders. We hold a lot of our stress and anxiety there. And I've had a lot of people say, before I respond, whether it's in person, over the phone, video chat, email, I just do that first. Because even just physical regulation of our system, this is part of what can get that full cortex back online. It's like, how do I check in with my body and just slow down? And that can really shift that. It's also helpful to do some grounding. This goes into the mindfulness category of DBT. You can check in with your senses when we're feeling really emotionally triggered, or we're about to react or respond to someone in a conversation that may not be ideal. What I'll do is just check in with my 5 senses. If I'm sitting at my computer, what does the chair feel like? What does the ground feel like under my feet? What can I hear? What can I smell around me? Like all of these things that just quite literally grounds us to the present moment. Even if you checked in with your 5 senses and then responded, you're sort of back to literally your present space and can then proceed instead of just kind of spinning in our mind or, in kind of this dissociative anxiety, and that doesn't help us communicate very well. Also, when we get anxious or stressed or triggered, our breathing is shallower, which makes us more anxious. Just taking 5 breaths, just slowing down. These types of things don't need to take a lot of time. You can do them anywhere. People don't know you're doing them. I think this is where it can be really helpful to figure out the ability to tolerate distress and distress tolerance skills. Start with the ability to practice those skills anywhere, anytime. And I think sometimes people will say, my distress tolerance are my self-care strategies I use after work, like I take my dog for a walk or I exercise. Those are really good preventative things that we can do for overall well-being, but it's really critical that we also have strategies we can put in place any second we need them. And so when we are in a stressful environment and maybe work is crazy right now for so many reasons, it's hard to, if we're going into that thinking, I don't have any way to cope until the workday ends. And that will lead us to this really kind of up and down in terms of how we're feeling. So all of these things I think can be helpful to remember to do in the moment. All right, so some communication strategies. If there is a disagreement, because as we all know, there are so many things going on in the world, everybody has different opinions and everyone is under stress and there's so many things. Yes, so someone just asked about whether there's a copy of the presentation. Great question. As a reminder, on your interface, if you click the little arrow next to handouts, you'll see a PDF of this entire slide deck that you're welcome to download. So some steps to address disagreements. So important, I realize that that is very subjective and different people may have very different opinions on that. But this again is kind of checking with when our ego gets in the way, we feel like we have to address everything. And sometimes it's deciding the why behind if we're going to address a situation. So is this impacting my ability to do my job? What are the reasons I feel like I need to address this? And if the reasons underlying are, I just need them to agree with my point of view, or I just need them to understand that my point of view is the right one, or whatever the case may be, it might be an important thing to step back and be like, I don't know if that needs to be a conversation then, so it's really deciding, kind of taking that space between if we decide to talk about something, if it even needs to be talked about. And if it does, because of course there are times where it's going to be something that you do have to have a conversation, I always think it's helpful when we go into conversations that might be disagreements or something that's coming up that is a challenge, is to go in with proposed solutions. So instead of here's the problem and leaving it at that, here's one suggestion I have that could help both of us moving forward. Anytime you can go in with a measurable proposed solution that ideally benefits everyone, it's going to have a more productive conversation that can, again, kind of focus more on the positives and next steps instead of just here's what's wrong, the end. And then all of us know, I don't think this is news to anyone, this is just a whole section on not gossiping. And that is just, human nature. It's really hard not to do this, but especially when everyone's under stress, when there are a lot of different feelings, opinions, thoughts, it's very easy to be like, I can't believe this person thinks this or said this. And it doesn't help us to go down that road. It doesn't help the organization to go down that road. And so I really, really try to just focus on remembering the importance of being direct and assertive if you do have a concern with the specific individual. Obviously, if there's, issues that you feel like you need to talk to a supervisor about, but really reducing that triangulation makes a really, really important piece. So let's see here. Yeah, there was another question about copy of the slide deck. Yep, so again, those slides are downloadable if you click on the little arrow next to handouts there on your GoToWebinar interface. So anyone watching today can just download the copy of the slides. And then we should be posting a copy of this actual webinar itself onto Cascade's YouTube page. I'm not sure exactly what day it'll be up, but usually is up in a few days. So the webinar itself with me teaching it should be on YouTube. All right. So some things to consider for communication tips. What do I do? So this first one, so often people will say, I tried to have a difficult conversation, it didn't go well. And a lot of times what can help communication being more effective is like basic needs are met. So essentially it's like that term hangry, like we don't want to try to communicate when we are hungry or we're tired. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but if you're going into a difficult conversation, have a snack first. It really does make a difference. And this is also if you are communicating with someone, even if it's just virtually, or if you've reintegrated into the workplace and you're around people in person again, when we are feeling triggered or we're not feeling super balanced, it really does change our body language. And it's hard for us to realize how important that is. But we know that on the receiving end, if someone has more hostile body language or less relaxed, I don't necessarily, doesn't have to be hostile, but just less relaxed, we can just feel that difference. So really checking with your body language when you're communicating with people. The other thing is a lot of times we just need to change our routine or habits. For example, if you always have meetings with someone, say on a Monday morning, and they don't always go very well, maybe it's just because it's Monday morning and neither of you are in your best mood that time of the week and day. So try just saying, I'm wondering if we could move our meetings to Wednesday afternoons. How does that work for you? Because, we can just kind of, with everything going on, and see if that changes anything. And our brains and our bodies, again, like I mentioned earlier, really fall into habit. And so if the meeting's always the same day, always the same setting, and it didn't go well one time, when we continue to have it in that same day and setting, we'll just kind of, again, that self-fulfilling prophecy. So even just a logistical shift in terms of day, time, setting can truly sometimes kind of reset that system. And I'll talk about I statements here a little bit. And then primary and secondary emotions, it's thinking about, again, if we're thinking, I'm a little bit more irritable today, sometimes what's underneath that is stress, anxiety, burnout. And so we can notice that in ourselves. We may notice that in other people. And that can also help with trying to take things less personally. It doesn't mean that it's appropriate to be irritable and snippy with other people. It just means that a lot of times what I think we need right now is just at least a core level of group empathy and compassion. Like, we are all struggling, we're doing the best we can here. And all of us have a role to play in creating as much safety as possible in the organization. I know there's some questions that have come in as I'm talking. I'm not ignoring anyone, but I'll answer some questions at the end. So some things to try, I agree these are stressful times, but I would like to focus on work right now. So maybe someone's really wanting to talk about, a bunch of stuff that's going on in the world or opinions about things. And it's okay to set boundaries with that. And you can do that in a way that's an I statement instead of telling them they should or shouldn't talk about something, or because that tends to not be super helpful. And then really focusing on my priority right now is everyone's safety. So kind of having that be this communal space of, I want everyone to be safe right now. And then these are all kind of these you statements. You should or shouldn't feel that way. I would recommend never starting a sentence with that towards yourself or other people. You're wrong, you're being rude. All of these can just trigger more of that dynamic that is not helpful for either person. So really those I statements are important to practice. And like it says here, the other thing is that I've seen this show up where people will take I statements, understandably, fairly literally. And so they'll say, yeah, I'm using I statements now. And the example is, I think you're being rude. So that's not actually an I statement. You just put I at the beginning of the sentence. So really being careful not to take these quote unquote I statements too literally. And really it's about only speaking from your experience instead of defining what they are doing or not doing. A lot of times when people are feeling triggered in the workplace, or if there's a disagreement, sarcasm can show up as a form of passive aggressive behavior. So being really mindful of falling back on that. I think when we're uncomfortable or frustrated or aren't sure kind of how to deal with the interaction, sarcasm can show up. So be really, really mindful of setting boundaries with that. It is not particularly helpful. And then if we are in a conversation that is challenging, a lot of times we will over talk, and that kind of goes into this fog and jade dynamic. We over explain ourselves. We, when we're anxious, we talk a lot about something. And so if you are in a conversation with someone, I try to really think about, again, if I'm about to say this sentence, what is the purpose of it? Is it respecting me and this other person? Or am I just kind of going on and on about this, and it's because I'm just kind of anxious talking. So slowing down, being concise, being clear can really help. And this is where it's understanding, is it a statement or not? And kind of like what I mentioned earlier, is it important or not? Sometimes people will just say a statement, well, I guess nobody cares about anyone's safety. I'm just making that up. That's not a question, that is a comment. And it may or may not require a response. And sometimes we feel an automatic need to respond to everything, whether it's a question or not. And so when we're about to respond to something, especially if it's not a question, it's determining, do I actually need to respond? Is that going to help proceed with us having a safe work environment, being mutually respectful, or am I just triggered and I feel like I need to say something to this? So one thing that really helps me is if I'm about to react to something someone said, the first thing I'll do is, did they just ask a question or make a statement? And why am I about to respond? And is it a healthy reason or not? Or am I doing this from a balanced place? And then this also, sometimes I'll have people say, I don't know how to work with someone who has a different opinion. As adults, we always will at some point. So that goes back to dialectics. Part of our work environment is we're going to work with other people who have different opinions, different perspectives, and at the same time, we have to work with them. So I think shifting away from this isn't going to work until we're on the same page about this topic. We may not be, and so how is this? How can I make sure that we can still work together effectively? And that can be kind of going back to some of those examples of ways to communicate. I really want to focus on this work task today. Kind of shifting away from some of those other conversations. All right, I think this is our last slide. I'm being very mindful of time, and I didn't want to go too long and not have time for questions. Talking about communicating, there's so much information. All right, so with understanding psychological safety, this is really where it's kind of stepping back into the larger system. So far, we've been talking a lot about our individual skills and what we would use on kind of our individual basis around communicating effectively, but there's also organizational safety. And I think it's important, even as you look at this slide, there is a lot of research around this. And there's also a lot of research around one of the other huge indicators of success as an employee is level of emotional intelligence, not necessarily skill set in that area. And so this goes back to, can an employee tolerate distress? Can they regulate their emotions? Can they maintain professionalism at the workplace? Like, these are all things that are our job to learn those skills around and to practice, because just like, and I appreciate everyone who's did those polls, we know, we all have work to do in that. And so that's where it's really, how am I personally contributing to making this a socially and emotionally safe workplace? And so what I wanted to do is this, as promised, last poll question. So I'm curious about this now that you've kind of seen this definition of what psychological safety looks like. And there are people in today's webinar from all sorts of different organizations. So this really is kind of an overarching check-in with everyone. So I'll give you a few moments to see how you feel about answering where you're at on that one. Okay, we've got about 70% of you voted. I'll give it another 10 seconds. All right. This one was 84% of you voted. It's a good amount. Okay, let's see where we're at. All right. So this is great that 64% of you say somewhat agree, 16 say strongly agree, but as you can see, there's a score in every single one of these categories. This goes back to every organization's different in terms of what it does, how many employees there are, what is it in person, is it virtual, is it mixed? There's all these different categories. And so however you chose, whichever of the 4 options you chose on this poll, it's really thinking about, okay, how did I choose that? How was I really sitting there thinking, how am I going to answer this question? How do I measure this personally if I'm thinking about that in my own organization? And what are things that I could do personally? Again, learn how to communicate more effectively, all of these things to contribute to that. Are there ways that I could advocate for things that I need at the organization? It's completely valid and important to advocate for our needs as employees. So if you're feeling burnt out, if you're feeling stressed and you need support from the organization, that goes back to that solution-focused conversation. So going to a supervisor and saying something like, here's one thing that would really help me feel less burnt out during this time. And that is a way to have that advocating conversation that is solution-focused. And, really, again, thinking about, do I feel psychologically safe, and what does that look like? And am I also contributing to that in terms of everyone else? All right. So I'm not skipping the questions, but I'm putting our contact information at the end because I think, it's helpful as a reminder that we may, try all of these things, be like, okay, I'm really going to try distress tolerating and see how that goes. And be like, all right, I might need some help with this. Welcome to the club. If you need assistance, that's what Cascade Centers is for. So a lot of times people will say, I really tried, stress management. I tried to distress tolerate. I'm really having a tough time still. You have access to free counseling sessions. You have access to immediate counseling via phone. If you call that 800 number 24/7, 365, you can immediately talk to a counselor about whatever you need. It is a crisis number, but you also can call it for any reason. And so if you just need to talk to someone and be like, I'm having a rough time, or I'm, struggling with this person I'm working with, and, whatever the case may be. There's also all sorts of other resources. We offer legal consultations, financial coaching. You can get help with finding resources for things like childcare, elder care. So I wanted to make sure you had, those numbers up and had access to that too. All right, so let's see here, see how we're doing on the questions that are coming up. So as a final reminder, if you do want a copy of the slide deck, that is that PDF under the handouts, if you click that arrow next to handouts on your interface, you'll see that slide deck right there if you'd like it. Again, this webinar itself will be up on YouTube shortly. And if you just go to YouTube and search Cascade Centers, you'll see our entire YouTube channel. We have tons of archived webinars and other video resources on there. And let's see if there's any other questions here. Okay. So one person's talking about, and I appreciate this, and I don't think you're alone in this, where they're sharing that if they let their guard down, for example, kind of self-regulation, self-check-in, self-awareness of how they're feeling, they'll get emotional at work. And that might lower the perception that I'm competent at my job. I'm just summarizing what they wrote into the question section. I definitely can promise you're not alone with that. I think that it is really challenging to find a balance of authenticity and honesty on an emotional level and otherwise, and then want to maintain professionalism and feel like we're, valid at work. Part of that psychological safety and contributing to psychological safety is that if someone does get emotional, that we don't immediately undermine them or not think that they are valid. But that's easier said than done. So that's where it's a balance of deciding, okay, I don't know that I want to get emotional at work, but I don't want to repress all these emotions. And that goes back to maybe I need to call a counselor at the EAP and kind of get out some of that emotional stuff and process some of that and then come back, and maybe I'll be in a more balanced state to still be authentic and express my needs, but may not feel as emotionally raw. And so I absolutely hear you with that. And it's not that all of us, our workplace, you know, we have to get our work done. We have to do a lot of tasks. It would be hard to just be super emotional all day and still get things done. So it really is, you know, kind of that twofold approach for us, you know, for all of us in the webinar today, or just anyone, of thinking, you know, how do I make sure that I am compassionate, non-judgmental if someone does get upset? And then for us, really determining, if I do, number one, we're all human, so there's nothing wrong with you. And then also, you know, if I don't want to be super emotional at work, then maybe I need to have some time to process that. And I think that's also goes back to, what do I need right now? Everyone's feeling, and I don't want to project my assumption, but I think a lot of us are feeling really, really burnt out and stressed. And it's like, when would I even have time to process that stuff, you know? And we sometimes have to schedule that in. I can tell you right now, I used to lead group therapy groups, and I had a client in group therapy one time say she scheduled crying into her day. And she was like, I didn't want it to just like show up when I didn't want it to happen. So I would schedule time to cry into my day. That was a time that worked for me, you know? So that was her strategy. And I think sometimes we just have to be like, what do I need right now to get through this, you know? And yeah, someone's asking about what do you do if a coworker always talks about other people? That kind of goes back to that earlier slide of, you know, it's a really stressful time right now. I really want to focus on work right now. And we don't have to get into you should or shouldn't talk about others. We can't control other people, but we also don't have to engage in that behavior. And so I try to, there's an acronym called LRS, which is least reinforcing stimulus. So if it's something that I just don't want to engage in, I will just say, you know, I've got a lot of work to do and I really want to focus on that. And oftentimes if an individual finds out that they're not really going to be able to get a lot of reciprocation of gossip with them, they may not come to you as often anymore, but you've kept it professional and just used an I statement about that. So I've tried to really kind of focus on that and just sort of disengage from that. But sometimes it kind of takes time to practice that, but that's a common issue. I hear you. All right. Yeah, so, you know, someone had typed in about the challenge of like virtual meetings versus in person. And yeah, you can't see all of the body language, and there's just different ways of communicating. And I think, yeah, of course, you know, there's certain things that you can still see in terms of body language, but not completely. And we do the best we can. So I think it's back to still being mindful of our own body language, whether it's virtual or otherwise. Even if you're on the phone, sometimes you can just tell, you know, you can get a vibe. If you're anxious on the phone, or if you feel like it's kind of a challenging phone call, stand up. That'll oftentimes reduce anxiety. But yeah, I think we've all been having a really, you know, it's been an interesting process of navigating how we communicate virtually, and what's working and what's not. And that can be something that can be a conversation in terms of that psychological safety. You know, what is working and what isn't in our team meetings when it's virtual? You know, what is the best way for people to feel like they can get their ideas across? You know, what's effective and less effective virtual and in person? And that can even be an open conversation with the team. And sometimes, you know, we've all been doing this for a long time, and sometimes just kind of getting a group check-in on how people are feeling and what would work and not work can be helpful. All right, it is 10:59. I promised we wouldn't go past 11. So thank you all so much for attending today. This will be on our YouTube page soon. If you need anything else from the EAP, from Cascade Centers, please contact us. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful, safe rest of your week, and take care.